The information found in this podcast is not a substitute for help from a licensed mental health professional. Hi, and welcome to the Women in Depth podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Lourdes Viado. Join me as we explore the inner lives of women, their struggles, fears, hopes, and dreams. We'll go beneath the surface and take a deeper look at what is hidden, unknown, uncertain, and uncomfortable. Hi, and welcome back to the podcast. I am very excited today to welcome Dr. Tracy Alloway, who is an award-winning psychologist, professor, author, and TEDx speaker. She has published 15 books and over 100 scientific articles on the brain and memory. She has also provided consultancy to the World Bank on reading in developing countries and is a sought-after speaker internationally. Her research has also been featured on BBC, Good Morning America, The Today Show, Forbes, Bloomberg, The Washington Post, Newsweek, and many others. She was also featured as an expert in the documentary The Observed Life. Hi, Dr. Alloway, and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here with you.
I am very intrigued by your research, and I've always been very interested in understanding how the brain shows up in our behaviors and understanding it so that we can actually use that knowledge to create lives that are more meaningful, more effective. And as a therapist, just understanding the brain in terms of recovering from trauma or anxiety, I know how powerful this information can be. So thank you so much for writing this book.
Oh, thank you so much. It was a real pleasure and a joy to actually write this. As a researcher, as a scientist, for myself, I just wanted to be able to find research that was not just a broad brushstroke, that wasn't just a one size fits all, but to really be able to understand how the brain works for us as women, not just for us as humans or us as people.
Yeah, I remember reading in your introduction, you said that this is the book that you wish you had read when you were finding your way into adulthood. And as I went through it, I said, yes, I totally agree. So could you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I grew up in Malaysia and moved to the US when I was quite young. I've lived in the UK. That's where I got my PhD and then moved back to the US. So I feel like having experience in these different cultures and countries, you hear these different statements and sometimes they're myths. And as a young girl growing up, I wish that I had a way to be able to navigate between what was just a statement that was describing how my brain was working and what might actually have been a myth that maybe I didn't have to follow or subscribe to. And so, really, that motivated as well a lot of my own research. And of course, as a professor, I see many young women about to make their way into the professional world, and I, get to hear their conversations and their expectations, and it just motivated me and inspired me to want to get some of the science of how our brain works out there, so we could all understand a bit better.
And I just had to also, kind of laugh to myself when I was reading your book. Just what you were sharing really affirms that, yes, the brains of women are different, not better, There really are differences. And I was just so grateful to know that this is now something that is accessible to women. And we can use this information to, I think, number one, understand ourselves better and also, I think, accept ourselves and love ourselves more.
Yeah, and that was one of the big pieces. I wanted to just describe what's happening in our brain so that, first of all, we can have an awareness. So, some of the myths include, are women more emotional when we make decisions? Do we have to be more like a man to be a good leader? It wasn't like exactly as you said it, and I put that in the introduction. It's not to say that one brain is better or worse than another. It's really, first of all, to create an awareness of the mechanism. How does it actually work? And then the follow up to that is so that we can have an appreciation. And so for me, one of the chapters that really comes to play is when we look at risk taking in decision making. And again, one of the myths there that I encountered both in science and in everyday conversations is that women are not risk takers when we make decisions. And as I wanted to unpack the science and as I began to interview women and talk to women, I found that that wasn't necessarily true. We just use a different metric when it comes to decision making. And I wanted, that second part for us to have an appreciation of how we make that decision and how we can really lean into that and maximize that to our own advantage.
So, can you share a little bit more about when you talk about the stressed brain? How can women use this understanding about our brains for making decisions and understanding the role that stress plays? Because I thought that was very significant.
Yes. And for me, it was fascinating. That particular study came out of my own research lab. And we know from other existing research that we have what's called two pathways when we have to make a very difficult or stressful decision. We have what's called a cold decision making center, and that refers to our rational brain, and it sits in the front of our brain. It's called the prefrontal cortex. And this is the part that kind of looks at the big picture, that utilitarian approach. And we have a second decision making pathway called the hot decision making pathway or the emotional pathway. And so in my lab, and I wanted to follow a suit and give my participants a very stressful, high stakes decision where you may have heard, or your listeners may have heard, to something called the trolley dilemma. And it's now made its way into popular media. It's been shown on some TV shows where they talk about the trolley dilemma. And it's set up like this. You're watching this happen, and a train or a trolley is coming at top speed, high speed towards you, and it's going to injure or even kill five people. But you can save the day. If you flip the switch, if you kind of move the track that the train is on, only one person will get harmed, but you will spare five other people. Now, typically what happens is that women are often found to make what's called a hot decision or an emotional decision. And I found two things. The first thing I found is that women are perceived to make an emotional decision under stress because we are motivated by a desire to protect. We don't want to cause harm. And as a result, we say, well, we can't harm anyone in this scenario. And first of all, the caveat here is that other researchers have found that as your listeners may be hearing this, you may think, well, this never really happens. No one has to make this kind of, very difficult life or death decision. But in fact, other researchers have found that in the lab, when people are asked to make this decision, they show all the signs of stress, of concern, they really view this as a high stakes decision that they would as if this were really happening in real life. So we know that this scenario, first of all, is a pretty good reflection of when we have to make high stakes decisions in everyday life. And importantly, we know now that women may be perceived as making an emotional decision because we're motivated by a strong desire to protect. We don't want to cause harm. So that was the first thing that was just fascinating to me, that we're not actually weak or poor decision makers. We're just motivated by an entirely different metric that is very powerful. We want to protect the people around us. But what I found was really interesting, and this is from my own research, from my lab, was that if you needed to flip that switch, if you needed to make a cold decision, a rational decision, and move away from that desire to protect, there's a very simple tip. And I talk about it at the end of the chapter. I call it a think takeaway. And I found that if you put your hand in a bucket of ice for 1 minute, it induces a stress response in your brain. And this is called the cold pressor task. And other researchers have used that in different contexts. And it is stressful enough that our physiology changes. We actually show physical signs of stress. And we also cognitively feel stress. So both of these happened in my lab with my participants. They were saying that this is very stressful for me right now. And I took their physical changes as well, and also showed an elevated physical response to this stressor. But this is powerful because what this does is it overloads our amygdala. So when your hand is in that bucket of ice, your hot decision making center, your amygdala, is so busy focused on sending out this fight or flight response to the stressor that it now frees up your prefrontal cortex, your rational decision making center, to make a different decision. So let's put this in a real world context. Let's say you have been headhunted, you've been offered this amazing new job. It's in another city, so it does involve you moving. So your first response might be that hot decision making kicks in. You may think, well, I don't want to let my boss down. What about my team? I've been working with them for a few years now. We work really well together. What would they do if I left? And so again, you see that our desire to protect is kicking in. And you may feel like, well, what about my professional development? How might I benefit from that? And you're having a hard time switching and focusing on that instead. And that's where that bucket of ice can come in and be really helpful, because you can flip the switch and move away from a hot decision making to a cold decision making pathway instead.
That's really fascinating, just also to understand what the emotions are about in this decision making process, and then also a way that you can actually help your brain to switch so that you can make the difficult decision. It also reminds me of when you talk about women's decision making process, it made me think about your chapter on the intelligent brain, which I thought was fascinating because at first, and I just was laughing at the beginning that there's this myth, first of all, that women are more honest and lie less than men, but actually the reverse is true. As you go into it, and I'll let you go ahead and share, what is it though about the lies that women tell?
They were two things that I found really fascinating when I was writing this chapter. So some of it comes out again from my own research lab, and some from other researchers who've done some fascinating work. The first thing I reported in the chapter, I talk about in the chapter, is if we look under the hood. So if we actually look at brain scans, when men and women are asked to tell different kinds of lies, different things are happening. So both men and women were put in a brain scanner, and they were asked two types of questions: personal questions, like, do you have a sister? Do you have a brother? And then general information questions. And what was interesting was that when it came to personal information, the men showed that their brains, back again to that prefrontal cortex in the front of the brain, the men's brains were working harder to lie about personal information about themselves. The women, it was almost effortless. They didn't have to work as hard when they were lying about, again, personal information about themselves. And that could be anything from their age, their income, their family background, and so on. And the researchers suggest that it could be that women have more experience, or society is set up in such a way that women may be penalized more frequently if they don't answer personal information in a particular way. So we just become more adept, more skilled, and therefore use less effort when we have to lie about personal information specifically.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting. And that also that women, when it comes to, I think you described it as prosocial lies.
Yes, that's
Yes,
right.
right.
So,
The prosocial
yes,
lying. Yeah.
yes. And again, here we just think of lying as, do we lie? Don't we lie? But
Yeah.
it's more nuanced than that. We tell different types of lies. And researchers have classified these in two broad ways. One is what's called antisocial lies, which simply means lies to protect yourself. If you think of a child, did you eat the cookie? No, I didn't eat the cookie, even though there are crumbs in their face, because that's going to protect themselves. They don't want to get in trouble. They don't want to time out, and maybe they even want more cookies. So they lie to protect themselves. Another type of lie would be what's called a prosocial lie. So they may say, did you see your brother eat that cookie? And at this point, a different mechanism kicks in where they don't want to see their brother or their sister get in trouble. And so they would lie to protect them. And here I found, again, this was from another research lab, where the researchers reported that women were more likely to lie prosocially if it would protect someone else.
Mm.
But what was interesting is that I had a chance to look at these two types of lying in young children, in 4-year-olds. And I found that even as young as 4, the girls in my study would be more likely to lie to protect someone else. So here it was a very simple game. They were just asked to shoot paper balls into a waste paper basket. And the researcher, had the back turned. And of course, we were taking a look at what the children were doing. And then the children would throw the balls into the basket, and then the researcher would do the same. And we would ask, did the researcher cheat? Did you cheat? And we found that the young girls, these 4-year-old girls, would be more likely to lie to protect the researcher compared to the boys in the study. So again, It seems to be, maybe our culture encourages young girls to protect each other, to think more of
Hmm.
that group mentality. But this was certainly one of the things that I thought was fascinating, that it's not just in adults that we're doing this pro-social lying, but even young girls, it seems very natural for them to do this.
So, we have a lot of women who listen to the podcast who are creatives, who are entrepreneurs, who have a lot of projects and goals that they are really wanting to get off the ground. And so, I was wondering if you could share some of the brain science behind creativity and how women can best use this information to be successful in reaching their goals and making these ideas realities.
Yeah, and this was such a fun chapter to write because, first of all, I got to interview a fascinating female comedian, and second of all, it's the ideas that I talk about. And I give a little activity for the readers to do. And I don't want to give too much away, but the activity that I talk about in that specific chapter, I also get to do with my college students. We have a lot of fun looking at what creativity is. Now, here we do see that men and women are creative in different ways. And again, just to set the scene here, creativity can be defined as thinking outside the box or divergent thinking. So, in other words, coming up with an idea or solution that is different from what you might expect. And of course, this is sort of, the golden egg. We all want to come up with this idea that is a little tweak or a little different from what everyone else is doing. And here I report studies where people look at what's happening in the brains of men and women. And for men, when they're being creative, the brain tends to be localized. So they're using a very specific area of their brain. Maybe the visual area of the brain is being activated if that's where their solutions are coming from, a more creative solution. Maybe they're thinking of language in a creative way. So the Broca's area, the language center of the brain, is being activated. But the bottom line is it's very local. It's just one part of the brain. In contrast, for the women, it's a generalized activation. So different parts of the brain are being activated. They may be thinking of past experiences. So the hippocampus or long term memory is firing. They may be thinking of something they saw, and that part of the brain is being activated. They may be thinking about something they read or conversation they heard a few months ago, and that part of the brain is being activated. So we see, it's more diffuse if you're thinking of how the
Mm.
brain is working for the female brain. And I think sometimes as women, we may sell ourselves short because we may kind of even tell ourselves, hey, focus, just think of this one thing. And we're doing ourselves a disservice because this generalized way of thinking or this diffuse way of thinking is actually our strength. It's actually a bit of our superpower when it comes to creativity.
So, just knowing that about ourselves and not trying to approach something in that singular way is a really helpful way to get our creative processes going
Yep.
and to support that.
Absolutely. And, another tip that I talk about in the book is a way to cultivate that. If maybe some of your listeners are thinking, well, that's not me, I don't really think of different ideas. I also give tips in the book of how to cultivate, thinking creatively or thinking generally, like we're talking about.
And for, our listeners who are curious about what is there about the female brain that can help us when we are in the process of seeking a romantic partner.
Yeah, that was an interesting chapter to write too, because I was able to look a little bit at the personality research for this one. And, we always talk about, oh, you should have a certain type. And I even look at large scale cross cultural study of what men and women indicate is the best type. By best, I mean what we perceive to be the most successful in a long lasting partnership, and really try to map that onto the science and what really does the science show ends up being helpful for long-term bonding in a relationship. And I talk about a few things. I talk about different personality traits that tend to endure in a relationship and which ones tend to be less enduring. So if you've heard of the big five personality traits, these are things like extroversion, conscientious or hardworking, agreeableness, neuroticism, and open to new experiences. And I don't want to again reveal too much, but I hope that your listeners will feel excited and motivated to peek at that chapter to see which one of the traits turn out to, again, based on scientific research, to be a good predictor of a success in a relationship. And by success, again, I'm defining this as a what individuals rate as satisfaction in a relationship and, a length of relationship as well.
And, I get a lot of books that I review, and a lot of authors who want to share their information on the podcast. And I just want to tell you that your book is one that I sat down and was able to read from front to back. And it was very engaging. And I really appreciate the helpfulness. And I really think that for all women, if you are wanting to understand yourself and to be more effective and to, I would also say, accept yourself more and be more loving towards yourself, I really feel that this book is a very helpful tool in supporting you in that. And just to let our listeners know, we touched on a few of the amazing topics and, there's so much more, but there are also chapters on happiness, on leadership, as well as understanding generosity and empathy. And so there's just so much here for women. And I encourage women to get their hands on this book, to share it with other women in their lives. And I feel like this is just another way that we can support each other and to appreciate our differences and allow ourselves to just be women, to be who we are and not try to be like men or hold ourselves up to myths or beliefs that our culture or society says that this is how it is. This is a really helpful book for, I think, not just for women, but I think it's helpful for even men to start to understand and see women differently.
Yeah, I really appreciate you saying that. Thank you so much. It means so much to hear that. And I get so excited when I get to talk about it because, as we started this podcast talking about it, it's certainly a book that I wish I had as a bit of a guide growing up as well. But I've heard that from male colleagues as well, saying, "Oh, I'm buying this for my wife just so I want to be able to read it too." So
Yeah.
I know a little bit more about what she's thinking. I want to read it with my teenage daughter so I can understand she's embarking into adulthood. I want to know that process too. So it's been exciting to hear the feedback too from, as you said, not just women, but mothers who want to read it with their daughters and husbands and partners who want to read it, as well. So I appreciate you saying that. Thank you.
When will your book be available to the public, or maybe it is already? And what's the best way that listeners can either learn more about you or get in touch with you if they'd like to work with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So the book is out. It's available for pre-orders right now. We have some fantastic pre-order bonuses, including a coaching session and video coaching sessions that are available as well online anytime that they want to access that. The book will be out on May 4th, so we're getting pretty close. It's pretty exciting. It's available where all books are sold, and my website is tracyalloway.com. And I would love for your listeners to drop me a line, come say hi, and I've lots of videos and information up there as well about the brain, about memory and how it works. And I'd love just to be able for them to connect with me as well.
Okay, thank you so much. And I am grateful for this time we spent together. We're going to put all your information in the show notes so that our listeners can get in touch with you, can get their hands on this book. And I'm very excited about sharing this conversation with the world.
Thank you so much.
Take care. Thanks so much for listening to the Women in Depth podcast. I hope it brings you a deeper understanding of yourself and others, and that you found some insights that illuminated and inspired. If you like what you hear, please consider supporting Women in Depth with a one-time or recurring donation. Any amount is appreciated and helps us continue to provide free, quality content for the world. If donating resonates with you, you can find the donation link on today's show notes. You can also follow Women in Depth on Facebook and YouTube, and if you haven't yet, please subscribe on iTunes. Again, thank you so much for listening, and see you next time.